Okay, well, hello everybody. I suggest we get started, and a few others will probably be joining us shortly as the meeting or the deep dive progresses. So first of all, thank you very much to everyone for joining us today. The topic of today's conversation is fixed point targets. Oops, sorry, I need to talk about, but and targets using corridors and ranges. The choice of the and as opposed to having a versus is deliberate because the idea of today's session isn't to try to decide whether one is better or worse than another, but just simply to discuss approaches and support the wider membership in understanding the topic a little bit better. To date, the majority of banks who have set targets are using fixed points ones for various different reasons. Some of them are technical, some are data related, some are strategic, but some are using ranges, and two of those will be presenting their approach to us today. So in terms of the agenda that we have today, I will very quickly at the start, just after this, provide you with a quick reminder of ways of working, antitrust rules and so forth. Then we will have the presentations from the different speakers. We'll be doing about 10 minutes each per person, and I'll come back to introduce them afterwards. And then at the end of the session, depending on how much time we have, we'll look to have general questions from the audience to the presenters. And if we use the 90 minutes, we use the 90 minutes. If we have finished before the 90, then that's fine, we gain that time. We don't have to go all the way to the last second if there are no further questions. So in terms of the agenda today and the speakers, first of all, we'll have Blair Bateson from Ceres, who's going to provide us, who's a director of the company network for them. He'll provide us with a bit of a contextualization of the question and the topic here in terms of what is being used in the marketplace, some observations of what is happening, and therefore that sets the scene a little bit for the rest of the session. We then have Jez Andrews, who's Director of Investment Leadership at the NZAOA, so also of UNEP FI, and she'll provide an overview of what is being done at the Asset Owner Alliance at the moment, because again, I think this is helpful in terms of context to understand what is being done outside of the banking community. And then we have two banks who'll be presenting. We first have Daisuke Tezuka from MUFG, who's a VP of Sustainability Office in the Corporate Planning Division. He'll provide us with an overview of MUFG's approach to target setting and therefore the use of corridors and ranges. And then we'll have Catherine Hosking, who's Vice President of Climate Strategy from Barclays, who will be doing the same in terms of Barclays' approach. So as I said, about 10 plus minutes each. If you've got questions that pop up at the time, please put them in the chat, or otherwise we'll try to answer a few after each session. Otherwise, we'll do it right at the end. And I think everyone is on mute already, but if you're not on mute, obviously please stay on mute. You will have probably seen the recording button switch on at the start. This meeting is being recorded, so we'll be circulating the recording to, well, we'll be putting, sorry, the recording on the NZBA members page afterwards, along with the presentations from today. And in terms of ways of working, just a little reminder, the general antitrust competition laws that we have to follow and everything that we talk about here. And likewise, as I said, I mean, of course, this is recorded, but there's still general Chatham House rules that apply. And this is in terms of, apart from the speakers who are not NZBA, the two that are not NZBA members, everyone else who's here should be an NZBA member. So we're within our own community here to share to each other. So on that note, that's just my quick introduction done, because otherwise I will be probably, not to say repeating, but I'll be forcing Blair to repeat some points that he's about to make. So I'm going to stop sharing and I will just wait to make sure that Blair's able to share his screen. And then afterwards I'll hand over to him for some context setting. And Blair, just to confirm, I can see your screen. So over to you.
Great. Thanks, Simon. And hello, everyone. I'm Blair Bateson. For those of you that don't know Ceres, we're a sustainability nonprofit based in the US, and I help lead our.
Ja, per E-Mail. Musst dich dafür anmelden.
If people could just mute
Dann
their
gab's heute Morgen.
lines, please, that would be fantastic.
I've just muted him, so it should be okay now.
Great. So yeah, Ceres is a US-based sustainability nonprofit that works for sustainability in capital markets, and I help lead our banking work across the organization. So great to be with you all today. And as Simon said, just want to provide a little bit of context for this discussion. Hopefully, will be helpful. So This is as of October, so I apologize if any banks have recently set or updated targets and you don't appear on this slide. But we've seen 5 NZBA banks that use ranges for all of their targets that they've set so far, and 4 others that have used ranges for specific sectors. Generally, there isn't a pattern in terms of the 4 banks that are picking specific sectors. It's all different sectors, so there isn't a trend there. And all of the other NZBA banks using fixed point targets for their targets. So as Simon said, it really does lean towards the fixed point targets at this point. Most of the banks that are using ranges, it's a small sample size, of course, but are generally calibrating them with the high ambition being 1.5C or net zero by 2050, and the other end of the range being something to the effect of current policies or current targets of our clients, something in the range of, what might be possible in a current policy environment. So that's where we see the landscape today, and I think you'll hear a lot more from 2 of the banks that have set targets in this way later on, so I won't scoop them. What I really wanted to talk about is, from our perspective, the main purposes of target setting from the perspective of different stakeholder groups, and how this question of fixed point versus corridor targets sort of fits into thinking about the purposes of the targets that you may be setting. So I think we've identified 3 here. There's certainly others, but these are really 3 critical ones that the banks we work with, we know, are all thinking about, and we would advise all banks to think about. The first one is sort of communicating the bank's vision of the energy transition. I think one of the key purposes of target setting is demonstrating what the organization wants to achieve in the climate space. This can also include demonstrating alignment with a national goal or a regulatory requirement of some kind. Basically, it's the bank setting out some guideposts to the direction of travel with respect to climate. And so this is obviously the highest level of the 3 purposes, and really, I think stakeholders who are interested in this part of the target setting are really going to be keying on the top line information about your target. So what is the temperature alignment? What scenario have you selected? What sectors are you starting with? But probably for this grand communication of vision, the methodological details of the target are going to be less critical. Getting to the range point for this one, I think our view here is that ranges can help if they add to the narrative. So, the banks that have set targets that say, the lower bound is something we could do today or something we see as achievable today, and the upper bound is 1.5C. I think for this particular purpose, that makes some sense, right? You're adding to your narrative about how the energy transition is likely to go by setting targets in this way. And the risk here, I would say, is on both sides what we call precision without accuracy. A single point target for 2050 particularly, but even 2030 may convey sort of a unjustified sense of certainty when there definitely isn't certainty. There's a lot of variability out there, but also a range could convey, I guess, overdetermination of how things are likely to go if it's not communicated clearly. So just leave that there for now, but happy to come back to it in the questions. The second purpose we see is informing your staff and your clients, trying to get everyone rowing in the same direction, and really helping you ultimately achieve the target that you've set. So we all know what gets measured gets managed, and so staff are going to be looking at the target that the bank has set in order to calibrate what they're doing in their day-to-day jobs, and clients are going to be looking to banks' targets to understand what they're going to be expected to do from the perspective of their financial partners. And so there's certainly something here about setting an example for clients. So, if you would like your clients to set targets that have corridors, then perhaps that's a way you would want to go. Or if you'd rather see point targets, then that might be something as well. Here, the details really come into play, particularly with the creation of incentives. So obviously, getting staff to prioritize achieving climate targets and getting clients to cooperate, there needs to be incentive structures there to help with that. And I think overall, having a range here can help if it adds clarity, if it helps staff and clients understand the target better. But if it adds confusion, if it's something like, well, we don't know really where in this range we're supposed to be, that could be more detrimental. The last one would just point to is as a basis for comparison. And this is generally different stakeholder groups, civil society like Ceres, but most importantly, investors are going to make decisions about capital allocation and other things by comparing banks' targets to one another. And your targets may not be designed for comparability. In fact, we know that they aren't. Some analysis that we've done, they're actually quite difficult to compare, but people are going to do it anyway. And so for banks that are setting ranges or corridors here, would really say, be thoughtful about what your midpoint is, because that's probably how you're going to be compared to banks that have fixed point targets. Overall here, probably having a fixed point target does make it a little easier to compare. But the key element here really is disclosure. The methodology needs to be normalized, and investors need to be able to sort of make an apples to apples comparison, which they can't necessarily do unless everything is very transparent. So we just close by saying that, there's a lot of assumptions and a lot of pathways that get us to net zero by 2050 or earlier. And having a range could be an effective way to convey this by saying, something like, we're going to get to net zero between 2045 and 2050. That can be really helpful, but it's not the only way to kind of develop that narrative. Just, again, think about your midpoint. Think about that your midpoint should be aligned with the goal that you want to get to, net zero 1.5, we hope. And then, this way of setting ranges based on sort of current policies or some kind of current situation versus your ultimate ambition, just be careful about how that gets communicated, because one risk of that is that, folks sort of focus their energy on the lower ambition part of the range. And they say, well, as long as we get to the bottom of the band, we're okay. And we end up sort of locking in a suboptimal scenario, a 2C or even, 2.5C scenario that we're maybe on track for today. So just, whatever path banks choose to go down from a civil society perspective and from an investor perspective, which I know we've got coming up next, transparency about methodology and assumptions is just absolutely critical. So I'll pause there, can take any questions that folks have either now or at the end.
Thank you for that, Blair. That's really helpful. And I've actually had questions be sent through to me on, actually, if you can put your slides up, just because it bounces on those points, it'd be helpful to have it on the screen. Again, the last one. And if you've got questions either straight to me or put your hand up or in the chat. Thank you. It's asking, so thank you very much. That's really helpful, first of all, as a presentation in terms of, I think, as you said, there's three main purposes. Well, there may be additional ones, but three key ones, I think, in terms of target setting the direction, communicating the vision, informing staff, clients, in terms of what is expected, and then also the basis for comparison bit. But in terms of the question that, and therefore within that, there's the whole, I guess, questions around the added value of going to the nth degree of detail in 26 years' time, in terms of, is whoever the CEO then going to really be looking back to what was in 2023 or 2022, in terms of, what is the value of the nth level of detail. This said, the question is here, which is for the last slide, I think is what it's bouncing on, because it refers to, on the second bullet point, you talk about the midpoint. So assume that the midpoint will be used for comparison and ensure it is aligned to the goal at 1.5. The question is, shouldn't a net zero bank ensure that the lowest point or the worst or highest, I guess, point in the range is aligned with 1.5 rather than the midpoint.
Yes, I mean, I think that goes to the third point a little bit, is that, folks may key on sort of what the minimum needed to achieve the target is. And so if we want to achieve global climate goals, then yes, we would hope that, any target is 1.5C aligned. But I think, that second point is really about the comparison. So would say, yes, ideally we want the whole range to be within the 1.5C band, but, for comparison purposes, the midpoint is maybe the most important.
Sure. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, but I think that, I mean, that's one where it will be interesting to hear in due course the viewpoints in terms of and this is not the purpose of the call today to make judgment calls in terms of validity, whatnot, but certainly some of the feedback we've had at different times is around precisely that point. If there's a range, well, that means that there's a range of different outcomes that you'll be aiming for, and how do you ensure that the ambition level is indeed as aligned with what the commitment was made initially. Question here in the chat, which I think you can see too, Blair. So I'm just going to read it out loud from Peter Sandhorn from Nordea. How do you view the potential risk of banks coming out with different requirements to climate transition plans if large differences exist in the ranges applied?
Great question. And I can't actually see the chat, Simon, while I have my slides up. So
do you want me to read it out again more slowly?
Maybe just one more time would be good.
What do you see as the potential risk which is linked to banks coming out with different requirements for climate transition plans if there are large differences between the different ranges?
Yeah, that makes sense. It's a great question because I think clients, usually are working with several different banks, and if there are a whole bunch of different requirements, then the risk is, from a climate perspective, that they'll sort of go lowest common denominator, and client transition plans will sort of be, sometimes we see financial disclosures be very legalistic and box ticking in nature, and there's a risk that that could happen with transition plans as well, and they wouldn't be communicating necessarily the most decision useful information. So I would say that that's one risk. And then I would say from a bank's perspective, if your peers are at different levels of ambition than you, it will be difficult to sort of calibrate your clients to your own target if there's wide variation, because those clients are going to be trying to find something that will be satisfactory to all their partners, banks and otherwise. And so, I guess if you see more alignment amongst banks, then it would be easier to sort of align clients with where the financial sector is at. So we see this in oil and gas, at least some projects we've been doing recently around scope 3 target setting for oil and gas. I think, some financial institutions are very insistent on that. I think we would be on that side of that discussion, but certain investors and financial institutions are not including scope 3 for oil and gas or have a weaker target. So we're seeing that in what the companies are doing. So I think the same applies here.
Cool. Thank you very much for that, Blair. And just to give sufficient time to the speakers, we're going to move on now to Jessica Andrews of the Asset Owner Alliance. But if you've got other questions for Blair, and likewise for all the speakers, we can come back to it at the end of today. Jessica, I'll let you share your screen and I'll give you a thumbs up if it works, and then I'll hand over to you. And I can indeed, let's just say, yep, I can see your screen just now. Over to you.
Super, thanks. Hope you can hear me also.
Can hear you too. Yeah.
Great, okay. Well, first, thanks for having me, and I hope that this is useful. I want to start off by just saying that I know there are differences between, the way banks and investors engage with the real economy. So, there necessarily be some differences here as well. But this is effectively how the Asset Owner Alliance is looking at it. My computer's doing something funny, but hopefully you can still see its slides.
Yeah, and you're now in big screen, so to speak. So it's good.
Okay, all right, super, thanks. okay, or it's frozen. No, there we go. Okay, so the way that we are looking at this is similar to the following. Many of you will already probably know the Transition Pathway Initiative. I'm using this as it's one of several tools, but it's a good depiction. So you have a couple of companies listed here, and then you have the different scenarios at the bottom. So there's national pledges below 2 degrees and now 1.5 degrees. And this is just an example for utilities, and I will show you how one of our investors is applying this. And I could have chosen another, Danske Bank actually, who is on the previous speaker's slides. They also have set targets across the board, but I just chose these because it was easier to utilize or to show. Okay, so CalPERS, set sector targets under the Asset Owner Alliance, and you can see there's both a 2025 and a 2030 target. This is across the investments in that sector for their portfolio. And you can see that it comes from just below the 2-degree pathway for both of these points in time. And it's not a range, it's a singular target. And I do agree again with the previous speaker that that can kind of give a false sense of precision, which I'll get into in the next 2 slides. But I wanted to just show how this is currently being done by the Alliance and in Alliance members. And in theory, we're not opposed to having a range, but I think it's a slightly different range than potentially what some of the banks are looking at right now. So I wanted to talk through that next. So you can just see here an example of how it's being done already. But if we take this, I think what's being considered, I think it's important what we understand what it means to have a range. So the way the Alliance is thinking about it is here's like sort of the midpoint of the different companies, those different colored lines, getting to a below 2 degrees or 1.5 degree pathway in 2025, and again in 2030. So the gap is bigger, of course. And then for the 2 degrees, which is depicted by the orange line, and that's sort of the corridor, that green line is between 2 and 1.5 degrees. I think when the Banking Alliance, some of the members are talking about a corridor, it's looking at this. This would not be allowable in the Asset Owner Alliance. But again, there is a corridor setup that would be, so I'll speak to that now. So the reason this isn't allowable is, you can see here, and again, this is just for illustration purposes, but the 2 degree and the 1.5 degree pathways here are just built on IEA. So IEA EPT 2020 is the 2 degree one, and IEA Net Zero by 2050 is the 1.5 degree one. So one model, 2 scenarios, 2 different temperatures is what that corridor is comprised of. In the Asset Owner Alliance, we're really only looking at no low overshoot pathways or 1.5 degree pathways, and there are a lot of them. There's a couple, over 100 that qualify in this category, and there are multiple scenarios from several models. So the first thing is, this is more what we would be looking at. So only the 1.5. So here only the IEA Net Zero by 2050 would qualify. And actually there's a caveat on that because it isn't actually ranked by the climate scenarios in the IPCC assessments. It's submitted, but it doesn't actually have a temperature one because of the way the scenario is designed. But in theory, it would align. The first one, the 1.5, would align. And so what we would be looking at is a corridor of these scenarios. So the corridor, here in this case, for the P1 to P3 pathways that are 1.5 degree aligned. And I just wanted to quickly highlight that this is CO2, so it's important to note that. And CO2 pathways are those that more or less reach net zero around 2050. You can see that in the very center of the graph. It's other GHGs that reach thereafter. So it's also important to note that if you're using a CO2e metric in your range, you're taking into account these other gases that reach net zero after 2050. And that's a small aside. So just again, several models producing several scenarios, and then some of those scenarios with the granularity to have sector pathways. And so this is just illustrative, but just to give the point, if you've got one model, it has these 4 scenarios, A, B, C, D. Within that scenario, you then have various sector pathways. And again, these are not the appropriate images. I'm just using them to demonstrate the point. And you can compare that model to another model. The two that really give sector pathways that we're most aware of at a 1.5 degree level are IEA and OECM, but these are not the images for them, just to be clear. It's just to provide the point. And again, if a model produces different temperature ranges, you have A and B being 1.5 and 2 degrees. And what, just to illustrate the earlier point, the corridor between 1.5 and 2 degrees is not something we would be looking at. But the corridor between 1.5 and 1.5 from different models is something that I think, we are looking at. And this is largely because no one model is going to get this right. So that's the very first point, is just there are a number of pathways more and more being developed every day. So long as they're roughly comparable, anything in the 1.5 range would create, decent corridors. The second point is that a company, and let's just say each of these colored lines is a sector in the real economy, each of the scenarios is done to a total carbon budget. And so a company is going to look for their pathway that suits them. And so if I'm a company in sector orange, I'm going to try to find the scenario where I have to do the lowest amount of work typically. And that's going to give you this sort of image here. But if I'm a company in the green pathways, green sector, I'm going to maybe look at the other model, because that gives me a lower bar to reach. And so the problem with this is if you add them together, you're not going to reach a total carbon budget, because each of the companies in each of their sectors is sort of choosing the threshold that is sort of the lowest range for them. And so if you give this range, that would include both scenarios A from each of the models. When you add it up across the economy for the different sectors, you will find that the lowest level of ambition potentially is being pursued by the various sectors. And that, I think, is just really important to keep in mind when we're talking about corridors, because it means that if you add it up sector by sector across all of the sectors, and they're each taking from the model or the lower range of the corridor, you have a scenario where the carbon budget is really quite underestimated relative to where it should be. So this is sort of when we think about corridors, it's really just two things to remember from AOA perspective. We're only allowing 1.5, and we are trying to think about, if using a corridor, how does that add up across the different models for total carbon budget. So just to summarize, the sector targets, especially productivity intensity-based sector targets, are really important, and this is what gives us an indication of how each sector in the economy is really transitioning. Again, noting it's different for banks and investors on how they're engaging with those real economy sectors. The company is likely going to look for the low end of that corridor. So again, it's really important for us that it stays at least within 1.5, but even within 1.5 across different models have different sector pathways, and so that gives you it can add up to more than the carbon budget if they're each choosing the pathway that's on the low end. But no one model has the answers, and it's not going to be exactly what a sector follows. So a range or corridor is reasonable. It's just really important to understand what the use of those corridors would mean when it comes to a total carbon budget. And I have a couple more slides just to give you an overview of what our reporting template looks like. So let me just skip to that one. This is our call to action to policymakers, and these are the metrics that we asked for, and we'd love to get feedback from the Banking Alliance on these items, because ideally we're aligning on the metrics that we're asking for. Just a reminder that the sector targets are only one of the 4 target types. And then lastly, this is what our reporting template looks like for the Asset Owner Alliance. And those 3 slides in the annex, happy for you to share them, Simon, and you can share, colleagues can follow up with me if they'd like to after. I'll hand back over to you.
Sure. Thank you very much for that, Jess. That was actually really interesting to hear. I think just one question from me actually before seeing if there's other questions from other people. You mentioned the obviously I'm paraphrasing, but the risk of the lowest ambition level curve or pathway being used on that one between the two different models. Have you thought of any safeguards to introduce from an overall carbon budget perspective to try to tackle that challenge?
So not really. I think the reality is there are very few models that actually have granular sector pathways that correspond to the financial sector classification. So what we're really seeing is, let me just go back a little bit more. Ooh, the animation's not so easy for moving back. But here, what we're really seeing is this is one model. And so by taking, the endpoints from here, you kind of have some assurance. That's so far the only safeguard that, we're seeing, because you have the different sectors. This is just the utility, but you can slice this anyway. And it's all coming back to IEA net zero. So in that case, it's keeping within the total carbon budget. But other than that, we haven't really thought about safeguards, and we don't really have members yet using corridors. But, I think in theory, it would be permissible.
Okay, and so just to pick up on that point then, so right now, no AOA members are using corridors, they're all using fixed point targets then.
Yep,
Okay.
that's right.
Okay, noted, thank you. Thank you very much. Are there any questions from anyone in the room for Jessica right now? Or of course we can come back to it later.
Simon, can I ask, do you have ideas already about what safeguards might be? Or will you get to that in a future
No,
presentation?
I was asking you.
Okay.
No, there's no formal views necessarily on that. Okay, good. Well, thank you for that, Jessica. We will now move on to Daisuke from MUFG. So I will share my screen, which you should be able to now see. And Daisuke, over to you. And just tell me when you want me to move forward, and I shall move forward.
Yeah, many thanks. Thank you very much. Thank you all for having me today. Simon, can you just flip over to page 4, please? Yep, thank you very much. Perhaps
Sorry,
the,
so is this page 4? Sorry, apologies.
no. I think this is page 2, 3.
Oh, sorry, I can see the one.
the
Sorry,
next one.
apologies.
Yep,
Yeah, different
this
numbers
one.
on my screen. Yeah. Thank you.
Yep, thank you. So this is a copy of the progress report that we have published last year when we disclosed our very first sector targets for our net zero commitment. And in this report, you will find our targets for the power sector and oil and gas sector, which we both set our targets using ranges. And on this page, you will see the basic concept of why we are using ranges to set our targets. It is quite conceptual, but this is a very important point that we want to stress. So I'll just start from explaining this page. So we are a member of the NZBA, so we are committed to achieving net zero by 2050. And on the other hand, we have made our own carbon neutrality declaration last year, committing, sorry, it was 2 years before, committing to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, which is well below 2 degrees Celsius, aiming for 1.5. And the heart of our approach is really based on the concept of supporting smooth transition towards net zero, meaning that we do emphasize the importance of decarbonizing the society, but at the same time, we would want to see the economy to grow as well. And taking the balance between these two might not be easy, but this is what we want to achieve as a financial institution, and that is our commitment under our carbon neutrality declaration. So when we start thinking about setting targets for the power sector and oil and gas sector, we thought that when we start thinking about the actual figures which we want to achieve, we want to make sure that there's good reason behind our assumptions, meaning that we do refer to the science-based scenarios, and we do make reasonable assumptions. And as a consequence of that, if we may not think that achieving if we think that achieving 1.5 would be a pretty ambitious target, we would then set another target under the 1.5 target to give us a minimal requirement for achieving the net zero. Noting that the 2030 target would be an interim target towards the net zero by 2050, we think that there would be various pathways. I think Blair mentioned in his presentation previously that there would be various targets, and the range is actually a good way to explain that. And so achieving the 1.5 level by 2030 is always our ambition, but our targets are not, our ranges are not necessarily, the lower target of our ranges are not necessarily achieving the 1.5 level. So if perhaps it might be easier if I give you an example. So Simon, sorry, can you just flip over to page 7 maybe? Yeah, so thank you very much. This is the page to explain our methodology and the actual targets for the power sector. On the right bottom, you will see our range ranging from 156 to 192 in intensity kilowatt hours, and this 192 level is actually not reaching 1.5 degrees Celsius when compared to the NZE scenario from IEA. However, it is well below the 2 degree scenario, which is the SDS scenario from the IEA. So in that, we are making sure that we are really within the ranges of the Paris Agreement, because I think the Paris Agreement itself is quite expressing the concept of a ranged approach, although the ultimate goal is to reach 1.5. So when we use our ranges, we do make sure that we are well below 2 degrees, and we make sure that we are making reasonable assumptions that might not be easy, but achievable for us to reach 1.5. So that is really how we approach our ranges. Perhaps another thing I might be able to introduce is, if you can, Simon, sorry, move backwards 1 page, please. Thank you. So this is a slide to explain our understanding of the characteristics of each sector, the power sector and oil and gas. On the right-hand side, you will see the chart from the IEA report 2021, explaining that the oil and gas sector has certain gaps in terms of the NZE level versus the APS scenario level, which demonstrates that there is a considerable gap between the real economic world versus the ideal 1.5 degrees pathway. And I think it is our mission to actually fill in these gaps so that we can achieve net zero by 2050. But this is another reason that why we take a ranged approach to ensure that we do not we will be able to support the economic growth whilst we try to help our clients to achieve their net zero ambition. So yeah, that is pretty much the basic concepts of the ranged targets for MUFG. Happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you for that, Daisuke. And I was jumping off the presenting it to see if there's any questions. There are none right now, and it may be that after we have Kate present to the approach at Barclays, then there'll be multiple questions for both of you. So okay, let's move forward to Kate's presentation. I'll let you share your screen, likewise I do the same, and then jump off. And then we can take questions from both banks about their approaches. And I can see your screen, Kate.
Do that?
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you, Simon. Hi, I'm Kate Hosking from Barclays. I work in the Corporate and Investment Bank Climate Strategy team. So I want to talk about Barclays' approach to setting our financed emission targets and the use of ranges more generally. So the rationale behind using range targets is to allow a quantitative view of a range of outcomes in the future. And this will stretch from a full realization of the scenario pathways, such as IEA Net Zero 2050, to a view of what might be achievable given a range of assumptions of both internal and external factors, which are quite typically out of a bank's control. As Blair pointed out, it's about building that narrative. So ranges can quantify that uncertainty, which in a single fixed target is often accompanied through a caveat. So, or multiple caveats actually. These caveats are key scenario assumptions around external factors which banks have less influence over. They include factors such as the pace of technological development, government policy, and changes in consumer behavior. And so Barclays' approach reflects this. We've set a number of 2025 and 2030 targets, and most of the 2030 targets are ranges measuring physical intensity, which I can show you very briefly. Let's see here. So you can see we've actually set absolute targets around energy, and they are single point targets. For absolute targets, the levers to meet these targets directly are much more straightforward, or sorry, much more directly applicable by banks. We can look at the development in client production volumes and in banks changing their portfolio size and composition, which can allow us to directly reach these targets. For intensity targets, which is the majority of what Barclays has set, simply reducing the size of the portfolio won't necessarily reduce intensity. So instead, the banks have levers that we can utilize. These include working with our clients to transition their businesses and reduce their emissions. This is both through clients' own kind of climate commitment targets and also providing them with particular financing or green financing to support their business to transition. Potentially exiting clients where that transition is not occurring. Obviously, we would like to avoid this where possible, but eventually, as we're getting closer to our target, it may be clear that we have to support the clients that are transitioning the most. Also, enabling changes in consumer behavior. Some sectors we can do this more than others. For example, in the real estate sector, there's more that Barclays can do given the portfolios and the products that we provide directly to the retail market. Whereas in other markets, it might be that we have less things to influence here. And finally, working with governments on suitable policies and infrastructure. So examples here include things like governments providing, say, charging stations for electric vehicles. We can finance companies to build those electric vehicles, but they need the infrastructure to enable people to use them efficiently across the country. So Barclays has set of financed emission targets as ranges, recognizing that not all of these levers are under Barclays' control. The upper end of the Barclays targets are in line with the IEA NZE 2050 pathway. The pathway incorporates assumptions that public policy intervention, shifts in consumer demand, and the adoption of new technologies will enable clients to accelerate their transition plans significantly beyond the client commitments or expectations. The lower end of the range reflects an estimated emissions reduction trajectory based on our current view of the sectors and the clients' pathways and their commitments. So you can see in our annual report from year-end 2022, our aim is to achieve the higher emissions reductions and not just aiming at the lower end. As I said, the lower end and the fact that it is a range is to be able to quantify that uncertainty rather than just having a list of assumptions, a list of caveats of which the single point target would rely on. Last week, quite interestingly, Larry Fink in the BlackRock's annual chairman's letter pointed out that, and clearly this is for a different business, but they see that investors need our help, asset managers' help, to understand the likely future paths of carbon emissions and how government policy will impact these paths. So again, you can see that understanding and quantifying the range and the potential outcomes of these future pathways are really important. Which is why we want to do ranges. So that's my super short thing. Are there any questions?
That's very helpful. Thank you. I guess just a question from me first. So I hear the points that make a lot of sense about the uncertainties that you face, but wouldn't whilst I guess part of it is obviously recognizing what a likely outcome will be, and so to speak, an outcome may be that it's not 1.5. Why, despite those uncertainties, shouldn't the target still be like that range be beneath 1.5?
Well, partly because we want to be able to illustrate what we think the economy is currently heading for. I don't think it does any good to be only representing a scenario view if we're not on track for the scenario in terms of a wider economy view. So the banks can only do so much in terms of looking at our own portfolios and supporting our clients. But the technological change and government backing in a lot of these scenario pathways is very, very large. So we need to acknowledge that.
No, thank you. That's helpful. And so it certainly wasn't a aggressive counterpoint. It's just to understand it a bit better. Thank you. Leave it open to the room. There's one question that Mark had asked earlier, which we can come back to afterwards, which is in the chat, but just specific to Daisuke and Kate with regards to the actual approaches that these banks have taken. Are there any specific questions? Okay, well, maybe we'll start with Mark's question. Just while I read out Mark's question, I'm also going to put a very quick poll in. Well, actually, I can't do two things at once. I can't read and do the poll. As soon as I read the question, I will let Blair answer it, and then I'll put a quick poll up, which is just basically to try to find out. There'll be two questions. The first is, do you use or intend to use in your first round of targets, either fixed targets, ranges, or both, just so we know. And then the second question will be, would you be interested in the NZBA providing additional guidance on the matter? So two relatively simple questions. It just helps us understand what work you may want us to focus on or not. Blair, the question from Mark was, the NZBA commitment should be about enabling financing and transition. Do you see a risk that banks exit the hard-to-abate sectors if they risk missing targets? Is it maybe easier to exit sectors instead of being accused of greenwashing or failing to achieve a target?
Yes, it's a great question, and absolutely we do see this risk. We sometimes call it leakage, and I think it's one of the reasons that sort of Ceres has differentiated ourselves from some other peers, at least in the U.S. space, where we are very focused on bank client engagement as sort of the primary solution or way to achieve the targets. I think we agree that the divestment approach, at least given the sort of fractured state of global finance, when it comes to climate is unlikely to have the real world emissions consequences that we need to achieve climate goals. So I think we really do focus on client engagement with the banks that we work with. And, I think there's some policies or design considerations for targets that can help with that. I mean, it's a little further afield of this presentation, but I would say Barclays just pointed out that intensity targets somewhat help with this problem. There are certainly advantages to absolute targets as well. And we sort of advocate for a translatable target, I guess you might say. But, one of the advantages of intensity targets is that it doesn't, you can't achieve them just by divesting. And I would say a rebaselining policy also can help with this. PCAF asks for that for the banks that are members of PCAF. And we haven't seen that from many banks is an understanding of when they might rebaseline, after selling off or acquiring potentially new assets. So maybe just pause there, but I hope I answered the question, Mark.
Thank you, Blair. And I mean, just to answer, in very short, from my perspective, yes, the NZBA commitment is about enabling and financing the transition, as that is part of the overall, commitment that's been made. In terms of would they exit the hard to abate sectors? Who knows? There's many risks, one or another, and certainly but based on the long-term relationships that a number of actors have, I see it unlikely, just because obviously they have a role in financing the transition, that the banks will just exit a sector because it's easier, so to speak. But obviously I do hear your point. Just while I have the floor, because there's another question which I'll be handing over to you, Jessica, because it's for you. But I have just put a poll up. So if any of you haven't seen it, it's a very simple one. This one is just, do you use or intend to use fixed ranges or both? It would be helpful just to get that feedback. And while you do that, I will read the question from Kim Croucher for Jessica. Jessica, it seems the reasons for corridors being considered in the asset owner lines is somewhat different to why ranges have been considered by some banks. The consideration by some banks is more that it is transparent to highlight where sectors are not on track to meet 1.5 and therefore avoid greenwashing. AOA is allowing corridors to take into account different assumptions within different models, but the aim is always to use 1.5. Has there been a discussion with an AOA on concerns that sectors are not on track to transition, or is the view that asset owners should focus on 1.5 goals regardless of wider dynamics in the sector, and perhaps rely on exits if needed to reach those goals?
Yeah, thanks, Kim. I think that's a really good question. I think you lay out a lot of it already. I think there's a difference between, what the targets should be from a normative perspective and then what the real economy is doing. So, the commitment for AOA is 1.5 or net zero. And so that's the type of targets we're asking them to set. Of course, as I saw in like the first slide I shared, most companies are well above that mark. There are a few that are aligned with sort of current policies, but, none are aligned with 1.5, right now across the majority of sectors. So I think that's the first thing. It doesn't mean, there isn't an ability to capture and speak to the companies in the sector that are well off from that mark. But I think we think it's important that that goalpost is set and maintained. Certainly, as right now, there are low-hanging fruits, and as we get closer to 2050, that's going to get that delta is going to get much bigger if they proceed at the current level, and we see that the requirements need to go straight down. It's much wider at 2050 than it is at 2025. So I think right now the idea is to really be engaging and setting ambitious targets at the portfolio level and engaging companies on ambitious targets now, and hoping that causes some movement. And as targets are targets, sometimes they're not hit, and I think that's acknowledged as well. And there will need to be real economy policies and support from the policy environment and companies themselves to make these a reality. And I think that's something the AOA is thinking about too, and that's why we issued this call to action on sector data, and really hoping that more data becomes available, more companies start thinking about what's needed to change, and policymakers are therefore also supporting that transition. I'll turn it back to you, Simon, in case if there's any part you want me to follow up on.
Nothing I was going to add, but I see that Blair's popped up on screen, so he may have something to add to what you said.
Yeah, I was just going to say, one thing that we're thinking about, and this doesn't apply to all banks, but it does apply to many of the NZBA banks, is that policy is not entirely exogenous. Many of the banks in this call have a lot of policy influence, and at least over here in North America, it's not necessarily being deployed. So recently was talking to some folks in the steel sector, and steel is one of those hard to abate sectors where the technology exists to do low carbon steel, but it's just not economic. So right now it needs policy support. And a number of steel companies were talking to the government here about that. And we asked them the question, well, were your financial institutions in the room supporting you? And they said, no, but that would have been great. And so, I know many banks are hesitant to engage on policy, but, if you view it as supporting your clients, I think there's a good case to be made for that. So,
Thank you for that, Blair. And just for those who haven't seen it, I put another poll up. I think already 40% of you have answered, but it was, would you be interested in the NZBA providing additional guidance? Yes, no, relatively straightforward. One with yes being the majority of the answers so far. There was a question in the chat for me, which was asking, are ranges in line with the NZBA target setting guidelines, or is it being analyzed to be included in them? I guess it's one of those answers where they were never, it's neither yes nor no in terms of it hasn't been discussed in the guidelines. The only thing that is set in stone, so to speak, is the requirement to be aligned with a 1.5 pathway. So I guess the interpretation within that is that so long as whatever you do is in line with 1.5, then it is okay. This is just my kind of shorthand interpretation here, not an official NZBA view. And I guess that is why the question that I just asked is relevant, to which 97% of you seem to say yes, it'd be helpful to get additional feedback, is because, like many things, just clarifying that, as we did earlier in the year on a few other topics, would be helpful, because we covered what we could when the original guidelines came out in 2021. But of course, not every point was covered, and this is one of them. So it's an imperfect answer to the question, but hopefully it helps. Okay, are there any other questions that anyone has for the room? I am not seeing any hands pop up, and I'm not seeing any questions come through. So on that note, I suspect we'll be coming towards the end of the meeting. So in terms of the poll, just so you know the kind of the answers that we had in the previous one, the first question being, do you use or intend to use fixed points ranges or both? We had 15 answers, 8 said just fixed targets, 6 said both, and 1 said just ranges. And to this question just now, would you be interested in NZBA providing additional guidance? 16 people said yes, and 1 said no. So with that, on that note, I will stop the meeting for today. We have the next session, which is looking at, I guess, more financial accounting kind of questions in terms of how to account for volatility and how to do rebaselining if needed for targets, next Monday at, let me just check my screen if it's either 3 p.m. or 4 p.m. at 4 p.m. Central European time. So hopefully you will be able to join us for that one. If not, thank you very much to all the speakers today, to Blair, to Jess, to Daisuke, and to Kate. Really appreciated the presentations. I will put them on the members page, and if you've got any other questions, please get in touch with us. So thank you very much, everybody, and speak to you soon.
Thank you, Simon.